The year was 1064, and in the blistering deserts near Jerusalem, a story that would sound more like myth than history was about to unfold. 800 hardened warriors from the cold northern landsmen who had lived by the sword, survived countless raids, and whose bodies were etched with scars, were about to confront an army 40 times their size. To most observers, the outcome was inevitable. Numbers always decided battles. But these men carried something into the desert that was far more dangerous than steel, an unshakable belief that they had been chosen by God himself. But before their shields clashed beneath the merciless Middle Eastern sun, the story began far away on the misty, salt-bitten shores of Norway. There King Magnus III, remembered by the epithet Barefoot for his strange custom of wearing Scottish garb instead of the usual royal attire, ruled with the restless ambition of a man who seemed never content to let his warriors grow soft. By Magnus's reign, the old gods of Odin and Thor had been officially abandoned across Scandinavia. Christianity had spread like wildfire, carried by missionaries, priests, and the sword. But if Rome believed this meant the Norse spirit had been broken, they were sorely mistaken. Instead of extinguishing the old fire, Christianity fused with it, creating something new. Something far more lethal. Men who carried the savagery of their pagan forefathers, but wielded it now with holy justification. When Pope Alexander II called for faithful Christians to defend the sacred places of Jerusalem, Magnus listened. For many rulers, the Crusades were political opportunities, a chance to expand territory or curry favor with Rome. But Magnus envisioned something different. To him, this was not about land or titles, it was about destiny. He saw an opening to forge an army that would merge Viking ferocity with divine purpose. They would not march south as mere soldiers of fortune. They would become the wrath of God cloaked in northern steel. The king's recruitment was mercilessly selective. He did not want green boys eager for loot. He wanted veterans who had proved themselves across decades of feuds and wars between Nordic kingdoms. Men who had stood knee-deep in blood on frozen fields and still swung their axes when others fled. The chosen few had to prove mastery with axe and sword, survive grueling endurance trials, and most importantly swear absolute loyalty to a holy cause. No hesitation, no doubt. For Magnus was not building an army in the traditional sense. He was forging zealots. For months, the training was unlike anything seen in the north before. The men drilled in close formations, a discipline foreign to the normally wild Viking style of combat. Byzantine mercenary instructors were brought in to teach cohesion, defensive circles, and coordinated strikes. The rough individualism of Norse raiding parties was hammered into collective unity. Each movement was rehearsed until it became instinct. Each shield wall locked as tightly as the prayers they muttered each night. But their preparation was not merely physical. Magnus understood something profound. A soldier's body could be broken, but his faith could make him unstoppable. Monks, priests, and warrior chaplains were brought to live among the men. They blessed every meal, every weapon, every night's rest. Dawn began with prayer, evening closed with psalms. The warriors were taught that their mission was not conquest, but sacrifice. That death on the battlefield was not failure, but the highest form of victory. They were to be martyrs wielding axes, their blood the ink with which God would write his will across the sands of the Holy Land. This union of old and new, the frenzied battle trance of the berserker, and the rigid faith of Christian devotion created something terrifying. To their enemies, they would look like demons who felt no fear, no pain, no hesitation. To themselves, they were the very instruments of divine judgment. Contemporary chroniclers who later tried to explain these men often stumbled into contradiction. Were they Christians or pagans still hiding beneath a thin cross? In truth, they were both and neither. They were the evolution of a culture in transition, an unsettling reminder that when belief and violence mix, boundaries blur and new monstrosities emerge. By the spring of 1064, the fleet of longships was ready. Their sails snapped in the chill Bergen winds, their hulls heavy with warriors, weapons, and prayers. Magnus did not tell his men to expect survival. He told them to expect glory. Many of them left behind families, farms, and fortunes knowing they would never return. Yet they boarded those ships willingly, some singing hymns, others chanting the old war songs of their ancestors. And when the drums sounded and the fleet began its long journey south, there was no turning back. For what awaited them was not simply battle, it was a transformation of warfare itself. For the first time, the raw ferocity of the north would collide with the structured empires of the south. The Viking spirit, reforged in the fires of faith, was about to be unleashed on a world wholly unprepared for it. And on the deserts of Jerusalem, history would learn a brutal lesson that sometimes numbers mean nothing when belief itself becomes a weapon. The Viking fleet left Bergen under cold grey skies, cutting through the North Sea with the rhythm of oars and the groan of timber. These were not raiding ships hastily thrown together for plunder. They were vessels of destiny. Magnus knew that no army, no matter how fearsome, could march directly to the Holy Land untested. His plan was deliberate. Every stop along the way would sharpen his men's blades, harden their faith, and prepare them for the desert crucible awaiting them. Their first halt came at the Orkney Islands, where Magnus recruited mercenaries accustomed to fighting in harsh winds and foreign climates. The Orkneys had long been a staging point between the Norse and the Celtic world, a place where identities blurred and warriors adapted. For the Vikings, these men were more than muscle. They were guides into the unknown terrains that lay beyond Europe. From the Orkneys, the fleet pressed south into warmer seas, landing along the coasts of Spain. Here, the Norsemen first tasted the sharp edge of a new enemy, the Muslim Saracens. These foes were unlike the Saxons or rival Danes of their homeland. They rode swift Arabian horses, wielded curved scimitars that flashed with deadly precision, and rained arrows from a distance with terrifying accuracy. The clashes were small skirmishes, more than full battles, but they were brutal lessons. Many a Viking learned, sometimes fatally, that their heavy northern shields were no match for the lightning-fast maneuvers of mounted archers. And yet, it was here that the Vikings discovered their true weapon. Not Greek fire, not armor, not even the axe. It was the terror they inspired. The Saracens were unprepared for the sight of men who did not flinch at wounds, who pressed forward even with arrows jutting from their bodies, who died with smiles as they shouted prayers to their foreign god. In battle after battle, the pattern repeated. The Saracens struck hard and fast, but when their enemies refused to break, their confidence faltered. The Vikings did not just fight. They made every moment of combat into theater, a spectacle of unyielding madness designed to infect the enemy with doubt. By the time winter drove them eastward, the fleet had become something more than an army. It had become a legend whispered in ports from Galicia to Sicily. Merchants spoke of northerners who fought like beasts and prayed like monks. Muslim scouts reported not just skirmishes but encounters with what seemed like zealots who did not fear death. Even Byzantine observers began to take note. When spring thawed the seas, the fleet sailed into the greatest city of its age, Constantinople. For many of the Vikings, this was the first time they had laid eyes on something so vast, so dazzling, that even their hardened hearts paused in awe. Towers pierced the sky, domes gleamed with gold, and the great walls seemed unassailable. Two men raised among fjords and wooden halls. Constantinople was not just a city, it was a miracle carved in stone. Here, Magnus secured alliances with the Byzantine Empire. The Norse had long history as Varangian mercenaries in Byzantine service, and this relationship paid dividends. The Byzantines were pragmatic. They saw in Magnus's fanatics both a useful tool and a dangerous force, better kept as allies than enemies. In exchange for loyalty and cooperation, the Vikings received upgraded armor, Byzantine-forged steel, and, most fatefully, access to one of the empire's most terrifying secrets. The formula for incendiary fire, Greek fire, as it would be remembered, was unlike anything in the known world. It clung to flesh and steel alike, and water only spread its flames further. To the Byzantines, it was a weapon of defense, jealously guarded. To the Vikings, it was the stuff of sagas. They studied it, experimented with it, even created their own crude but devastating versions, using local resins and oils. This was no longer simply an army of steel and faith. It was an army that carried fire itself in its arsenal, ready to unleash hell on its enemies. But what left an even deeper mark on Magnus's men was not the weaponry, but the exposure to Byzantine order. These were soldiers who had marched in formations so disciplined that they seemed to move like a single creature. To the Vikings, whose tradition of raiding prized individual valor, this was revelation, and so they adapted, again combining the old frenzy of berserkers with the cold coordination of Byzantine legions. It was as if Europe's two great warrior traditions had fused in the crucible of Magnus's camp. As spring ripened into early summer, the fleet turned once more, heading south into the Levant. By now, word of their advance spread like wildfire across the Muslim world. Tales of northern demons men who fought as if already dead reached Damascus and Cairo. Many dismissed these stories as exaggerations. After all, what were 800 men compared to the endless hosts that guarded Jerusalem? But others whispered with unease. Legends had a way of shaping reality, and already the Vikings were more than men in the minds of their enemies. They were becoming myth long before their axes struck the sands of the Holy Land. When their sails finally caught the winds toward Jerusalem, the Norse warriors were no longer the same men who had left Bergen. They had been tempered in blood, sharpened by fire, and lifted by visions of divine purpose. And waiting for them, in the dry plains near the fortress of Herodian, was an army 40,000 strong, an enemy certain that these northerners would be erased from history. But history, as it turned out, had other plans. The sun rose mercilessly over the Judean desert, turning the stones into fire and the air into a furnace. On one side of the arid plains near the fortress of Herodian stretched the might of the Saracen host, 40,000 strong. Endless columns of cavalry, the shimmer of polished scimitars, banners flapping in the desert wind, and the dull roar of thousands of marching feet. Dust rose in great clouds, obscuring the horizon. It was a sight designed to crush the spirit of any who dared oppose it. And then, in sharp contrast, there stood only 800%, a compact square of Vikings, shields gleaming under the pitiless sun, their axes and spears poised. They were silent, unmoved, an island of steel in a sea of enemies. To the Saracens they must have seemed like a curiosity, defiant perhaps, but doomed beyond question. The Muslim commander, Abu Naser, Shams al-Muluk, regarded the northerners with confidence. He had seen countless enemies break under the weight of his armies, and his strategy had never failed him. He would encircle the Vikings with cavalry, rain arrows until their shields splintered, then send in the infantry for the final blow. It was a tried and true formula, and against a mere 800 men, what could possibly go wrong? To him, this was not battle, it was extermination. But Magnus Barefoot and his captains had studied these tactics for months. They knew exactly what was coming, and they had forged a response as unorthodox as it was terrifying. These men did not come to Jerusalem to survive. They came to die spectacularly, violently, as martyrs who would drag as many enemies with them as the battlefield allowed. At dawn, Saracen war horns blared across the desert. The thunder of hooves followed, a storm of cavalry charging with scimitars flashing in the early light. The ground trembled under thousands of horses, the air alive with dust and war cries. And then the Vikings did something no one expected. Instead of bracing into a single shield wall, they split apart. 8 groups of 100 men each, forming perfect defensive circles with gaps between them. To an untrained eye, it looked like madness, like weakness, but it was not. It was the execution of a tactic they had perfected in their long training, the wheel of death. The first wave of Saracen cavalry surged forward, expecting to shatter a traditional line. Instead, they found themselves funneled into the spaces between the Viking circles. Once inside, the circles closed behind them like jaws snapping shut. Horsemen were trapped, their mobility crippled. Suddenly, what should have been momentum became chaos. Inside those circles, the Vikings struck with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Every blow followed another. An axe swung low to cripple a horse, a spear thrust dragged a rider from his saddle, and before the victim even hit the ground, a sword descended to finish him. Shields overlapped seamlessly, creating walls that absorbed the frantic counterstrikes of riders desperate to break free. It was as though the Norsemen moved with a single mind. But what truly unnerved the Saracens was not the discipline, it was the frenzy. These were not men fighting for survival. They fought as though death was their prize. They screamed prayers to their god in Old Norse, their eyes wide with battle trance, their mouths foaming with the frenzy their ancestors had once called berserker gang. And unlike the berserkers of old, these men's madness was sanctified by religion. Every kill was not merely survival, it was salvation. Horses panicked as their riders fell, crashing into one another. Men who had faced Byzantines, Persians, and Crusaders suddenly found themselves against an enemy that seemed immune to fear and pain. The first wave faltered. 1,000 Saracens lay dead within minutes. The Vikings' formation still held. From his vantage point, Abu Naser frowned. Losses, yes, but nothing crippling. 1,000 men was a small price for the destruction of this northern nuisance. He ordered his mounted archers forward, determined to pepper the circles with arrows until their shields and flesh gave way. The sky darkened as volleys of arrows arced toward the Vikings. Yet even here, Magnus's preparation revealed itself. During the night, each Viking circle had built makeshift fortification shields of fallen foes, scavenged wood, and stone walls. When the storm of arrows fell, they crouched beneath these barriers, patient, silent, waiting for the Saracens who had always seen smaller enemies scatter in terror under such barrages. This stillness was disquieting. The Vikings did not panic, they endured, and when the moment was right, they burst from their circles like wolves from a snare, charging straight into the mounted archers, who had thought themselves safe at a distance. The desert erupted in screams and steel. The Saracen army had expected an easy slaughter. Instead, they faced a nightmare. 800 men who fought as though they had nothing left to lose, who transformed every weakness into a trap, every disadvantage into an ambush. By midday, the legend of the northern demons had begun to take shape. Abu Naser, still confident in his overwhelming numbers, prepared to unleash the full might of his infantry. He believed sheer force would crush these fanatics, where strategy had failed. But he did not yet understand. The Vikings had been waiting for that exact moment. They had saved their most devastating weapon for when the enemy closed in. The midday sun blazed mercilessly over the plains, baking the ground into cracked stone and dust. Sweat poured from men and horses alike, but the desert heat did not slow the storm about to break. Abu Naser gave the signal, and with a roar that seemed to shake the very air, tens of thousands of infantry surged forward. Swords, spears, and shields glinted as the tide of men closed in from every side. A human wall of 20,000 bodies pressing in on only 800. For any ordinary army, this would have been the end. Numbers were supposed to smother defiance, like an ocean extinguishing a flame. But these were not ordinary men. These Vikings had prepared for this exact moment, and in their preparation, they had taken a piece of Byzantine sorcery and twisted it into something monstrous. When the Saracen infantry closed within 50 paces, Magnus raised his arm. A horn blared, not in retreat, but in grim summons. From the circles of shields came the hurl of dozens of clay pots, launched high into the blinding sky. For an instant they looked harmless, fragile. Then they struck the ground. The desert erupted into fire. This was no natural blaze. The pots were filled with a hellish substance acquired in Constantinople, a variant of Greek fire oil, pitch, and resins mixed into a burning nightmare. It clung to armor, flesh, and cloth. Men tried to beat it out with their hands, only to set themselves further aflame. Water could not quench it. The desert wind fanned it into hungry waves. In seconds, the battlefield became a vision of hell. Rings of fire encircled the Viking positions, creating infernos that split the Saracen advance into chaos. Infantry who had marched with confidence now screamed as their comrades burned alive beside them. Horses shrieked and reared, throwing riders into the flames. The Vikings did not hesitate. They used the fire as both shield and weapon. With guttural war cries, they burst from their circles, charging through the smoke and heat like demons risen from the abyss. Their armor blackened with soot, their eyes wild. They hacked through terrified enemies who suddenly saw not men, but the weapons they carried seemed designed for cruelty. Axes forged to tear through bone and steel alike. Spears tipped with cruel hooks that caught riders and dragged them screaming from their saddles. Some Vikings carried long knives, used not to kill swiftly, but to hamstring foes, so the fire could finish what steel had begun. And amid it all, the howling prayers in Old Norse hymns twisted into battle cries rose above the screams. Chroniclers of the time, both Christian and Muslim, would later write of this day as if it were a glimpse of the apocalypse. One Muslim account spoke of northern devils who burned the earth itself, while a Christian monk recorded that the Vikings fought with the fury of angels cast down, punishing the wicked in fire. For the Saracen infantry, discipline broke quickly. Men stumbled backward, tripping over their own comrades in their desperation to escape the flames. Officers shouted for order, but their voices were drowned by the roar of fire and the clash of steel. Those who tried to stand firm soon found themselves engulfed, their courage devoured alongside their flesh. And yet, for all the horror, the Vikings themselves paid dearly. The fire did not discriminate. Some of the northerners emerged from the blaze half-burning, their beards and hair aflame, still swinging axes with blackened skin peeling from their arms. They fought not to survive, but to take as many enemies as possible before collapsing in the dust. For every Viking who fell, 5, 10, even 20 Saracens died with him. Abu Naser watched from his vantage point, his confidence eroding with every passing moment. What was supposed to be a simple annihilation was becoming a nightmare. His cavalry had been humiliated, his archers routed, his infantry thrown into chaos by fire and fanaticism. Yet he still had numbers. He still had his pride. And so, in desperation, he summoned his elite, the Royal Guard, 2,000 hand-picked veterans, men who had never known defeat. They were the last and best hope to break the Northerners, to cut down their leader and shatter the spell of terror that held the battlefield. The order spread like wildfire: strike at Magnus himself. For if the giant king fell, perhaps his fanatics would finally crumble. But as the guard began their charge, shields flashing, voices raised in oaths of vengeance, the Vikings reformed. The circles opened, the flames behind them still crackling, and the 800 stood ready once more. Their king towered at the center, a massive double-headed axe in his hands, its edges glinting as if kissed by divine fire. What followed would not be battle in the ordinary sense. It would be something else, entirely a clash of symbols, of two worlds colliding. On one side, the disciplined veterans of Islam's strongest commanders; on the other, the fire-scorched zealots of the north, determined to die as martyrs. The battlefield held its breath. The next clash would decide not only the day, but the fate of thousands. The desert seemed to pause before the storm. On one side, Abu Naser's Royal Guard, 2,000 veterans, armored in lamella, their swords honed, their banners snapping in the furnace wind. They were men forged in 100 campaigns, warriors whose discipline had carried them through the chaos of battle time and again. On the other, the 800, fewer now, their ranks thinned but unbroken, blackened with soot, blood-soaking their tunics. And at their center stood Magnus Barefoot, tall as a pillar of iron, his double-headed axe glinting in the firelight, his presence as much a weapon as any steel he carried. The Saracen guards surged forward with a roar, their shields clashing, their hooves and boots pounding the earth like a storm rolling across the desert. For an instant, it seemed the Vikings must finally crumble under the sheer precision and force of this advance. But instead, they answered with a cry that echoed across the battlefield, a sound so raw it seemed torn from another world, half hymn, half berserker howl. Then steel met steel. The clash was brutal, like mountains colliding. The finest warriors of two civilizations locked in combat, neither yielding an inch. The Saracen guard fought with careful formation, each man covering his brother, blades darting with clinical efficiency. The Vikings answered with chaos sharpened into method shields smashing forward, axes cleaving with bone-shuddering force, spears dragging men down into the dust. For an hour the fight raged, neither side breaking. The desert air was filled with the ring of iron, the thud of steel biting flesh, and the guttural roars of dying men. Bodies piled in mounds where the lines met, blood soaking into the earth until the sand turned to mud beneath their feet. And in the midst of it all, Magnus was everywhere. He strode like a giant, his axe carving arcs through the smoke, felling man after man as though destiny itself guided his strikes. His presence was more than flesh and muscle, it was a banner, a beacon. Every time a Viking faltered, a glance at their king set their strength alight again. To the Saracens he seemed less a man and more a force, as if every blow he struck carried divine judgment. At last, Abu Naser himself entered the fray. He was no commander content to watch from safety. Trained in Damascus's finest schools of swordsmanship, he had fought in duels across the Levant. His reputation as a master of the blade was unmatched, his presence inspiring his men to fight on even when despair threatened. As he rode forward, his curved sword gleaming, both armies seemed to sense the shift. This was no longer a clash of masses. This was destiny narrowing itself into two figures. Magnus and Abu Naser met in the center of the chaos. The Viking king towered over his opponent, his axe heavy and brutal. Abu Naser was quicker, darting with the fluid precision of his curved blade, his movements honed by years of training. Around them, the battle seemed to fall into hush, as if the desert itself leaned in to watch. The duel began with sparks of steel axe against sword, shield against shield. Abu Naser struck first, his blade slicing in quick arcs, meant to bleed his opponent slowly. Magnus absorbed the blows with grim patience, his armor denting, his arms shuddering under the force. Then, with a roar, he countered, swinging his massive axe in strokes that could cleave a horse in two. Abu Naser dodged narrowly, the sand spraying as his footwork danced him out of death's reach again and again. For minutes they circled and struck, skill against savagery, precision against brute conviction. Abu Naser fought like a man defending his world, his people, his faith. Magnus fought like a man already dead, every strike an offering to God. But conviction has a weight that skill alone cannot bear. As the duel stretched on, Abu Naser's speed began to falter, sweat blurring his eyes, his breaths coming ragged. Magnus's fury only grew, each swing of his axe heavier, more relentless, as if the prayers of his men poured into his arms. At last, the decisive moment came. Abu Naser lunged, his sword flashing toward Magnus's heart, but the Viking twisted, the blade scraping against his mail instead of piercing. And in that instant of imbalance, Magnus brought his axe down in a great sweeping arc. The blow split Abu Naser's guard, biting deep. The Saracen commander staggered, his sword clattering to the blood-soaked ground. Silence fell for a heartbeat, and then Magnus struck again. The axe cleaved through flesh and bone, and Abu Naser fell, lifeless, to the desert floor. The effect on his men was immediate. For hours, they had believed sheer numbers and discipline would prevail. But the death of their commander shattered that illusion. To see their leader skilled, noble, undefeated until this moment, cut down by a northern giant, was to witness the impossible. Panic spread like wildfire through their ranks. What had begun the day as certainty of victory now curdled into terror. To the Saracens, it was as if they no longer fought men, but avenging spirits who could not be slain. To the Vikings, Abu Naser's death was proof that God's hand guided their blades. Their chants rose higher, louder, as they pressed forward with renewed fury. The battle was no longer a struggle, it was a collapse. 40,000 men, hardened by years of campaigns, began to break under the weight of legend being forged before their eyes. But what followed would not be mercy. It would be something far darker. The death of Abu Naser should have marked the end of the battle. In the logic of war, when a commander falls and the army shatters, surrender or retreat follows. But this day had long since abandoned logic. When Abu Naser's body struck the sand, it was as if the soul of the Saracen host bled out with him. 40,000 men dissolved into panic. Lines that had once held firm crumbled into stampedes. Officers shouted, begged, struck their own men to rally them, but terror had drowned out discipline. Horses reared and trampled their riders. Soldiers cut down comrades just to clear a path of escape. The battlefield that had begun as a contest of steel now became a chaos of fear. Magnus saw it and gave an order as chilling as it was absolute. No survivors. His voice carried over the desert winds, and his warriors obeyed with the zeal of men who believed they were executing God's will. What followed was not a pursuit, it was a hunt. For 3 days, the Vikings scoured the plains, the hills, the wadis. Every group of fleeing Saracens was cornered, every pocket of resistance crushed. They set ambushes along streams where desperate men sought water, encircled camps where fugitives thought themselves safe, and turned the desert itself into their trap. And when they captured survivors, they did not treat them as prisoners of war. They treated them as sacrifices. Each execution was accompanied by prayer, each act of violence sanctified as holy work. The numbers stagger the imagination. Of the 40,000 who had assembled to erase the Northerners, more than 35,000 lay dead when the sands finally settled. The desert was littered with bodies, blackened by fire, split by axe, pierced by spear. Ravens circled in the endless sky, their shadows crawling over the carnage below. Only a handful escaped, carrying with them not just the wounds of battle, but the far heavier burden of memory. Of the 800 Vikings who had begun the march, fewer than 600 remained standing. 200 had fallen, and yet, compared to the tens of thousands they had destroyed, their losses seemed impossibly small. Survivors would later insist that such numbers could not be true. Surely the chroniclers exaggerated. Surely legends had distorted the truth. But in the hearts of both Christians and Muslims, the massacre at Herodian became a story larger than truth itself. News spread with speed that matched the terror it carried. In Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo, whispers turned to shudders. If 800 fanatics could annihilate one of the strongest armies in the region, what would happen if Europe sent tens of thousands? Some Muslim chroniclers called the Northerners demons, others punished by God as a test of faith. But all agreed on one thing: the Holy Land would never again feel secure. Meanwhile, in Europe, the tale grew into something else entirely. Messengers and pilgrims carried the story north, each retelling shaping it more into myth. By the time the tale reached Rome, it was no longer merely about Vikings who had fought with reckless fury. Chroniclers claimed angels had fought beside them, that no arrow could pierce their consecrated mail, that their axes glowed with holy fire. Whether or not anyone believed every detail was irrelevant. What mattered was the effect. When Pope Urban II prepared to call the First Crusade decades later, he needed proof that God's will favored the Christian cause. He needed an example of divine intervention on the battlefield. And so the legend of Magnus Barefoot and his 800 fanatics became a weapon more powerful than any sword. If such a tiny force could annihilate 40,000, then surely united Christendom could reclaim the Holy Land. The massacre became less a memory than a rallying cry, an example carved in fire and blood. But there was a darker legacy as well. The methods Magnus pioneered, the use of terror as strategy, the sanctification of slaughter, the absolute refusal of mercy became precedents. Later Crusaders would copy them. Orders like the Templars and Hospitallers would model their discipline on the Viking fusion of faith and ferocity. Holy war itself was reshaped. No longer was it enough to defeat an enemy. Annihilation was seen as proof of divine favor. Magnus did not live to see this long shadow. He died only a few years later, in 1069, cut down in battle near Antioch. But in death, his legend only grew. In Scandinavia, churches were raised in his honor. Songs were sung of his warriors, of the desert that burned with northern fire, of the impossible victory that turned into myth. Young men who had never seen Jerusalem carried the story in their hearts. And when the Crusades began, many marched east, believing they would inherit that same divine strength. Yet for all the glory, the story also carried a warning. For the Saracens, the memory of the northern demons lingered for generations, a ghostly shadow across every battlefield. And for later historians, the massacre stands as one of the clearest examples of the double edge of faith. Conviction can move mountains, yes, but it can also drown deserts in blood. 800 men had reshaped the Holy Land, not merely with steel, but with belief. They showed that numbers alone do not decide battles, that fear, faith, and the psychology of war are forces as real as any weapon. Their story is both inspiration and horror, both miracle and atrocity. It asks a question that history still cannot answer. Was their devotion admirable or monstrous? Perhaps the truth is that it was both. For in the desert outside Jerusalem, faith did not just move men, it moved history, and its echoes still haunt us, whispering of the terrifying things human beings can achieve when they believe themselves chosen by God.